Hey everyone, today we're going to finish our conversation about government stabilization policies by looking at some alternative views on macroeconomics. There are different schools of thought on what the appropriate response should be to an output gap, either an inflationary gap or recessionary gap. And we're going to look at 3 or 4 of the primary schools of thought that are important to the AP exam. First off, we talk about classical theory as sort of the baseline from which to begin. In classical theory, economists looked at the market and said prices are flexible in the long run. Aggregate supply is vertical because changes in money supply lead only to changes in price level in the long run. So a classical theorist is not particularly interested in government intervention because from their perspective, government intervention, particularly when you're starting at a baseline of being in full long-run equilibrium, is really unhelpful and does not accomplish much other than causing prices to rise. That theory was predominant for a very long time until the 1930s when we had some major economic concerns facing the world and lots of different people looking for different solutions, which led to a lack of consensus as economists disagreed on how to approach things like the Great Depression. There was no agreement on what the right policy should be, though the schools of thought did begin to emerge. The leading school of thought is Keynesianism, built around John Maynard Keynes and his general theory of employment interest in money. His argument was that macroeconomic activism by the government is justified because the short run is an important phase in the economic business cycle. His famous line is that in the long run, we're all dead. His point being that yes, in the long run, prices may rise, but in the short run, government intervention can alleviate suffering, pain, and other problems within the economy. It can lead to an increase in output, which raises people's standard of living. And his perspective has widely been accepted by many, many economists, even many conservatives sort of work off of the baseline of Keynesianism, that government intervention is a worthwhile thing. Now, within his theory, he talks about, one, aggregate demand's impact on output. That because prices are sticky, particularly wages, an increase in aggregate demand can lead to an increase in output. So if, for example, aggregate demand were to shift to the left, that would create not only a change in price level, but a change in output. Whereas the classical economist is only concerned about the long-run change in prices, the output change is not that important to them, because they know that in the long run, the economy adjusts itself back to potential. Keynes is saying that period of adjustment is worth addressing. He also talks about animal spirits and what the role that those play in aggregate demand. He talks about bulls and bears, that if you have low confidence in the economy, you're being very bearish. And therefore, aggregate demand is going to shift to the left, and that creates short-term output gaps. And if you have high confidence, then you are very bullish on the market, and aggregate demand then typically shifts to the right. And his concern is that individuals can be driven by these animal spirits, and therefore it affects their purchasing behavior. The one organization or institution that may not be affected by these animal spirits then is the government, which can be as bullish as it wants because it can print as many dollars as it needs. Finally, he argues that fiscal policy is better than monetary policy. While both policies can be effective, Keynes is concerned about this concept known as a liquidity trap, which is when interest rates can be brought down all the way to 0%. The Federal Reserve can drop interest rates all the way to 0, but at that point there's a lower bound. It can't go lower than that. And if people's economic expectations are so negative that they think that they won't make money on business investments, then even if money is essentially being offered for free, businesses won't borrow it because they don't think they're going to earn enough money to pay back the interest-free loan that they're taking. If that happens, then there's no way for the Federal Reserve to get that money out into the market without forcing people to take the loan. And if you're in a free market, you can't force people to take a loan. So while federal monetary policy can drive the interest rate down and hopefully encourage people to borrow, it can't always force them to borrow. If you think about times like the 2008 financial crisis, the Federal Reserve dropped the interest rate down to 0, And it took a long time for businesses to borrow and for banks to give out money because they were afraid that they weren't going to earn back the principal. And so that's a limitation of monetary policy. Whereas fiscal policy, you don't have to worry about it. The government wants to spend money, they just print money and spend it. Send it out to the economy, spend. There's no limitation on what fiscal policy can accomplish, while there is limitation on monetary policy. The foil, or the opposite to Keynesianism at the time it was being developed, is sort of the Austrian School of Economics. It doesn't find itself on the AP exam, but it's worth investigating a little bit. Founded by men like Menger, von Mises, and Hayek, they had a much different perspective on government policy and how the economy works. They argued that the business cycle, this sort of boom and bust, grow and shrink cycle of the economy, is caused by an overexpansion of credit by the government. That making credit cheap and easy is what creates bubbles that lead people to placing money into industries and into investments that only appear to be profitable on paper but will eventually burst. And that bursting bubble causes major recessions and troubles within the economy. And so they're very much more of a laissez-faire, hands-off approach to intervention and stabilization because they're afraid that the government will create other problems while it's trying to solve the initial issue. A third option is what we call monetarism. That's looking at the business cycle and saying it's caused by changes in money supply. That fiscal policy is not as effective as Keynes believes, but rather that the economy can be guided and helped along through increases in money supply, using what's known as the quantity theory of money. The quantity theory of money has a relatively simple formula. It says that the money supply times the velocity of money, which is how quickly it filters itself through the economy, is equal to the price level times real GDP. So if you want to increase the economy's output, increase money supply. Now the challenge with quantity theory of money is that it assumes essentially that velocity is constant or predictable. And therefore, if you increase money supply by a certain amount, you should be able to calculate what it will take to get whatever nominal GDP you're interested in. There are examples of where it has borne out in real life, and then there are some examples in which it looks like it may have some problems. So I have an article that is linked to how it has been applied in the real world as a result of the pandemic in the last couple of years. But then we can also look at data that shows that the velocity is very unpredictable. So again, like all things in economics, it's a theory. It's not a law. And so that's a school of thought that people hold to and some people reject. Option 4, rational expectations theory. This theory is essentially saying that if people know in advance what the policies of the government are going to be, then they will take action to adjust to those changes almost immediately, essentially in the short run. Which means that the government cannot impact output because people are already adjusting to the expectation of more spending. So if you think the government's going to spend more money, then you know that wages are going to go up, you know that costs are going to go up, and so short and aggregate supply responds accordingly by increasing those wages but shifting back to the left. And so according to rational expectations theory, essentially, if I know the government's going to make an expansionary policy decision, I will take an equally contractionary reaction on short-run aggregate supply that will negate that goal. And so the only way for the government to successfully change output through policy would be to do it by surprise. In a free society where there's open conversation and debate over what the government's policy should be, it's virtually impossible for the government to surprise anybody with what it's going to do. When we meet in class, we'll talk more about each of these. I've got a couple of videos related to theoretical rap battle between Keynes and Hayek, which I'll link in the description. And we'll work on some problems, and I will see you then.